Okay, so we'll keep this one a little bit briefer. So in the last session, we talked about the general principles of effective alternative grading systems. And here we're just going to go over some of the high points of this. This is a pretty informal discussion. Feel free to jump in at any point. Just keep your mics open and jump in or raise your hand or whatever. So the basic point, well, we're going to skip over some of this. Usually I start off with a question asking, what do you most enjoy about teaching? What do you enjoy the least? And usually what comes up in terms of the least is grading. It's something that neither students nor faculty tend to enjoy. And Ken Bain, back in his book, in one of his first book on this, where he talks about what the best college teachers do, talks about, and in his more recent book too, talks about three types of learners: strategic learners, surface learners, and deep learners. Strategic learners are learners who learn what they need to do to achieve their goal, which is generally a grade, that the focus tends to be on grades. Surface learners are students who will do the minimum needed to get the minimum grade they need in order to pass the course so they can move on with their degree. And deep learners are those students who are interested in actually learning the content and actually creating, a good mental concept of how the discipline fits in and its role in their future lives and so forth. And we'd like to encourage more students to be deep learners, but the system of gradings the types of grading that we tend to do tend to encourage more strategic learning and more surface learning. And students have been exposed to that system pretty much all the way up from pre-K to kindergarten through high school, where the whole focus has generally been finding the grades they need to be successful in whatever they need to do, without as much focus actually on learning necessarily. And one of the purposes of alternative grading systems and the whole approach that Robert and David were just talking about is to shift the focus from grades to learning, to encourage students to become more interested in learning material. And in general, grades tend to not always be the best motivating factors. Again, for students who are trying to meet some minimum grade goal, it may help them engage in some basic learning, but when students do well, they're often content not to learn things more deeply. When students are doing poorly, they often get discouraged. So there's always a potential there, that if students fail the first course, the first exam or two, many students just give up and disappear. And we've been seeing a lot more of that recently. And again, much of the focus of students tend to be on grades rather than learning. And we talked about this a little bit in a workshop yesterday when we lost control of the keyboard here, which is another problem on this computer. But the main problem is the practices that students use tend to be ones that work really well in helping students learn enough material to be successful on high stakes exams or high stakes assessments. And none of them, though, tend to result in very much actual long-term recall. That what we'd really like students to do is learn material in a way that will stick beyond the end of the semester. But when they engage in cramming, when they try to cram in a lot of material and do it right before a test, or they read something repeatedly, those tactics tend not to encourage long-term recall. And there's a huge base of research on that. And this is one of the points that Robert Talbert and David Clark make throughout their book, that feedback is essential to learning, but grades are not. However, we do have, and there are those dates. Actually, my dates go back a little bit earlier, that the 100-point grading scale in some of the research I had done on this goes back to 1837, which actually the fact that there were two different dates there is why we posted the 1800s for that. But it wasn't adopted widely at Harvard until later. So it was, but it was done in math and philosophy earlier. But the main point of all of this is that we'd like students to shift their focus to learning and to encourage that, especially in a world of AI, where it's so easy to get computers to turn in graded work for anything that's done asynchronously. Um, and one of the simplest ways and the easiest ways of introducing an alternative grading system is a mastery learning approach. And basically with that, you give students either a limited or an unlimited number of opportunities to demonstrate their learning of a topic, and you only keep the highest grade. Um, and actually, and Theo made the point in the chat that policing and punishment are exhausting and not why we got into this line of work. And certainly I felt that very often, especially with some of the work that was coming in through AI. And before that, during the pandemic, there was so many students relying on Chegg for much of their work. And it was often very obvious. So we'd like to be in a business where we're focusing on helping students learn, and a mastery learning approach can do that. If you're doing it with, if you do asynchronous exams or quizzes, you can get test banks. Many of them are very vulnerable, again, especially now, to either AI or to places like Chegg. Although Chegg is not as popular now, they've become much less profitable than they were in 2020 to 2021, in part because students have shifted the academic integrity issues to the use of AI tools because they're less expensive. But there's a lot of ways of doing mastery learning. With multiple choice questions or algorithmic questions, you can give students a very large number of questions. And if you remind them regularly that the goal of the class is to help them master skills that are going to be essential for things they do later in life, that can shift some of the focus away, because they know that if they do poorly, they can still learn from that. And they're going to learn a lot more if they're actually submitting the work than if they're having someone else do it through them for them, or an AI system do it for them. But for classes where you're not using that, where you have essays and so forth, you can give students feedback and not necessarily assign a grade until the end, just telling students the areas where they need to improve. And that can be very customized, and it can be much more positive reinforcement for students than actual grades. I know when I've given tests back to students in class, if they do really, and we go over the test after that in person, when they take tests in class, the students who do well often just sit there kind of bored when we're going through it. Sometimes they'll answer and explain things. The students who do poorly will sit there looking really unhappy, but neither group tends to learn all that much while we go over it. So shifting away from that and giving students more opportunities for feedback and revision. And one way of doing that, by the way, is with, it's not quite mastery learning, but is with a two-stage exam, where in the first stage, students take the test individually, and then you have the students work in small groups and retake the test. Sometimes in the same class period, if you have a long enough class period. And that way they're getting feedback from each other on the second attempts. And then you can just use a weighted average of that. But giving students the opportunity, as was emphasized a lot in the last session, of trying something, making mistakes, learning from those mistakes without penalty, is really helpful in terms of student learning and motivation. And it's easier to do in the STEM fields where there's algorithmic questions, but it's a little bit tougher when faculty have to do grading in fields like writing classes and so forth. But you can still give students feedback at each stage, and you can also leverage peer feedback so that students do something, you give them some feedback, they turn in a new version of it, or you have other students giving them feedback to allow them, through some sort of a workshop in progress, which is, again, a type of mastery learning where you don't really grade it until you get the final product. In some disciplines, there's adaptive learning platforms available. In most introductory fields, particularly in STEM areas, there are some really good adaptive learning platforms out there that will basically let students work on topics until they master them. They can just go through, they start off with each course module with some type of a pretest. that assesses what they know and what they don't know. And then they get customized instruction and support and further quizzing that helps them develop the skills that they need, so that they're focusing their time on the things where they need the most work and not spending as much time on the areas where they already came into the class with a stronger background. And that can be useful. And again, that's available in many, certainly in STEM fields, but in many other disciplines as well. So it's nice. It builds in retrieval practice because students are practicing things over and over again. And the extent to which we do that, where it's the students doing the work rather than the instructors doing more work, the more they're going to learn. Because again, whoever is doing more of the work tends to be doing more of the learning. So we want to shift that to students as best we can. Now, the next step up, and this was something that Jessamine mentioned she's going to be doing, and if you'd like to see her rubric, send her a note, and she's happy to share her practice there. But specifications grading was developed by Linda Nielsen. She has a book on it. We've got a podcast with her a couple years ago, actually. And basically, what you do is you create assignments with very clearly specified, you create assignments with very clearly specified requirements, often done in some type of a rubric. And all the assignments are graded on a pass-fail basis. And then you generally allow some type of resubmission. Depending on the class, the size of the class, and the frequency of those, you might allow only one revision, or you might have one of the things that Linda Nielsen suggested is essentially some type of a pass or token system, where students are given a certain number of tokens for resubmission. But the key is basically students are given at least some opportunities to revise and redo things. And the grade that's determined basically is based on the number of assignments that they successfully completed. And you either, in A requires that you complete 20 assignments. A B might require that you completed 18 or 17 or 15 and so forth. Another possibility is you could have different sets of specifications, which moves it closer to a form of contract grading as well, where there's a certain types of specifications required for an A grade, a certain bundle of specifications required for a B grade, and another bundle of specification required for a C grade. So it could be the case that if you're going to get an A, you might have to submit a 20-page term paper with, et cetera, or a series of them. A B might require a shorter term paper, or might require some other form of project, et cetera. But the key is students know exactly what they need to do. They turn it in, they get some feedback, and generally with some form of revision. And often these projects are scaffolded so that this is true at each stage of the process. Another option, which is again a little bit further away from traditional grading, is contract grading. And one variant of that is labor-based grading, where you come up with contracts. The instructors sometimes define them. Sometimes it's done individually in negotiations with students, where each grade is tied to a specific set of criteria, which might include the number of allowed absences in class, the number of drafts of papers or assignments completed, the number of reading responses to papers that students have to read, or to articles, or to books, for example, depending on the discipline. And so at least part of the grade is simply based on the number of things that students do. And so that's another alternative way of doing this. And some people find this a little bit troubling because it's not necessarily, typically a labor-based grading system isn't purely a labor-based grading system, that there's usually some minimum standards for acceptable work. And it can often be combined with that type of specification system, where basically, as long as they meet the minimum standard for each of the assignments or each of these criteria, that's sufficient. They're not getting number grades, or they're not getting specific scores or letter grades on each individual thing. It's either acceptable or not. So that's another approach. And one the basic notion here with the contract grading system is that students know exactly what they need to do and they can track their own progress. The only concern that some people have, or one concern that people, including students, have with this is that they don't really get to see their grade until the end of the term. And that can provoke a little bit of anxiety, offsetting the fact that there's more certainty about what they need to do. And the most extreme approach is an ungrading system. And this has become increasingly popular. And the goal is to shift the focus entirely away from grading to, or from grades to learning, where students only receive grades when they're required to receive grades, typically at a midterm and a final. You have to, when you do this, and this is true for each of these, that you have to have very clear learning objectives, clearly specified learning objectives that students have to meet. And students then reflect on their progress. They're self-assessing their learning as they move through their learning journey. That could be done with a journal, which is shared within the with the instructor, or it could even be a class blog, or it could be a public blog, for example, which is used by some instructors. So the key is that students are working to reflect on their learning and assessing their progress as they go. And that's often done with rubrics that are either co-created at the beginning of the term with the students or shared with students at the beginning of the term. So they know exactly what they need to be able to do to be successful and what their goals are. And they're constantly throughout the class reflecting on that. And typically what happens, well, instructors are providing students with feedback. It's not that instructors aren't assessing students' work and grading it, but one of the benefits for instructors is you're not agonizing over whether this paper or this assignment is an A- or a B+. You're basically just always thinking about in what ways can the students improve the quality of the work? Has it reached an acceptable level? And if not, what do they need to do to move it that way? And that can create a much more individualized environment because we have students coming in with really diverse backgrounds, and some are capable of doing some really great things because they come in with a really strong background. Others are going to struggle to meet what we generally consider to be minimum requirements. But you can nudge all of them to learn more while they're in the class in a way with this type of approach that doesn't work quite as well when they're getting letter grades, because a failing letter grade or a C- letter grade or a D is not something that generally encourages students to be terribly well motivated. But if they're receiving information or they're receiving signals that they can improve their work in this particular way, that tends to be much less demotivating, and it tends to result in more actual improvements in students' work than when they receive letter grades, because research shows that when students get a letter grade, they tend not to use the feedback that you've given them. And I know many times I've provided students with lots of feedback on their final papers, and I've spent far too much time giving them this feedback that they're never going to use or look at. And it's too late if it's at the end of the term, unless they're going to go on and use this at some point in the future. And in an ungrading approach, midterm and final grades are determined by consultation between the instructor and students. And typically the way it works is that students provide a reflection on their learning and submit a grade preference. This is often done with a Google form, where the Google form would list the criteria that students are supposed to meet, basically the rubric criteria for the course, and students would self-assess their work, putting in a score for, where they felt they fit on that spectrum, and also at the end, and describing the work, describing their learning, describing their learning journey, and then submitting a letter grade preference. And then typically the students and instructors meet, have a conference, and then determine the letter grade. I know people, including myself, who have not used ungrading in class yet, are often concerned that students may overstate their performance. But people who do ungrading, and we've talked to a lot of people who've been doing this on their podcast, state that that's really very uncommon. That the more typical problem is that students often understate the amount of their learning because especially students who are first-gen students, students who are female, or students from traditionally minoritized groups, historically minoritized groups. And those students tend to be more subject to expectations and so forth, where they may not expect to be as successful. And generally, instructors who use this approach say they spend much more time asking students to reflect on their work and to think about all the things they actually have learned and remind them of how successful they have been. So, it's actually really encouraging when you talk to people who use this. And most people who move to an ungrading approach have not been willing to go back. I often teach classes of 300 to 400 students, and it just doesn't scale terribly well in a class like that. So I haven't moved to it there. I've come close to that in my capstone course and in other classes, but I still do give students some grades along the way, but I'm giving them a much larger share of feedback and much less grades on individual items as they work towards their final projects and so on. And I think, yeah, and okay. Yeah. And the stereotype threat is the main sort of concern that most people who use ungrading tend to report, that very few students tend to overstate how much they've learned. And when they do, generally, I've been told at least, they tend to back down pretty quickly once they've been reminded that they really didn't turn in very much work, or they did miss a lot of classes, or they skipped quite a few assignments. And generally, they tend not to be very resistant because, they recognize that you've been following their progress and they've also been recording their own progress. So that's what I've got. I do have in here this link. Let me see if I can, well, let me hop over there and I'll just put the link in the chat. Here's some resources on it, including some blog posts or some blogs, some studies, and some other information. Just to go through it quickly. There we go. Here we go. Okay, one more time. Let me maximize that. Some general information. There was a group at SUNY a couple of years ago, actually. It ended last year, that worked for 2 years on innovative assessments that looked at many of these things. We had a podcast with David Clark and Robert Chalbert this past, earlier this year. Here's some papers on mastery learning, specification grading, contract and labor-based grading, and ungrading. So just links to resources that might be helpful if you do want to explore any of these. And if you do want to explore any of these and you try it this semester, we'd be happy to have you participate in a panel discussing this at the end of the semester when we do our spring breakout workshops. So I kept this fairly short because I thought that last session may go a little bit longer. And it did, which I think was very useful. So any questions, comments, thoughts?
I just appreciate you organizing it into that concise list of like, here's some various alternative grading methods that are out there. So thank you for that.
And, and Robert had a really good point that most people don't adopt a pure system. Some people do, and some of the ungrading people treat it almost as a cult, where you either ungrade or you're just incredibly unfair to students. But most people end up doing some type of mix. Josh Eiler has been doing quite a bit on this, and he's got a book coming out later this spring or sometime early this summer, where he talks about ungrading, and he very strongly in favor of that, but he actually does a combination of ungrading with contract-based grading. Basically, if you want to be able to negotiate a grade or to have a grade, there are these minimum thresholds that you must do this many things. You must have fewer than 5 absences or whatever. You must turn in this number of reading reflections. You must do this. And then we can talk about your learning progress and so forth. And that's not uncommon. Some type of mix of these various strategies is very commonly used.
Really like the contract labor based. I shared yesterday that I teach capstones, and a lot of this, the students push back on when I say I'm not going to tell you what to do, right? Like, you know your career, you know what's next, you know best what your situation is. Now I'm going to push you to work hard and be your best self, but I really like the idea of basically creating the contract and proactively putting some more of that they can prepare. Right now I have them do a project proposal, but the proposal implies that they'll tell me what they're going to do and I'll either accept or deny, right? And I really like this language and thought around, how about you start by building what you want to do, and then we'll kind of negotiate and finalize it as a contract instead of that proposal, approve, deny language. Very cool. Very, I don't, just so much to think about. I actually was drawn to these sessions from reading that in other countries, there's like the teacher, but then the evaluator is someone totally different. And the American model that the supporter and the coach teacher is the same person who assigns the grading is unique. I don't know. You just kind of take some things as the foundation. Everybody does it this way, but that was where I was like, oh, maybe I need to do more co-grading and right? I don't know, get more people in on that, giving them.
Yeah, it's a very different system. And, in the European model, it's still really common to do, to just have that final exam at the end, typically at the end of the course, not at the end of college, but it's really common. And there was a request for access to the slides. I'll put the link in there. Yeah, so those are the slides too.
Awesome.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks for sharing.
Any other thoughts? Are there any other, has anyone experimented with any alternative grading systems that would like to be willing to share their experiences?
Yeah, I did a few last semester. I did a sort of divided it up a lot where I had fairly traditional assignments, but I had students self-assess the assignments. So at the top of the assignment, basically, they included a series of ratings on like effort, interest, completion, and then gave themselves a grade out of 20 points. And I would say 90% of the time, I just used their grade because it was pretty much what I would have given them. So it made things much easier, much faster. And the vast majority of the time where it mismatched, it was students under-evaluating themselves. So I had the same sort of experience that you find ungrading. The other thing I did, though, is I had students, because the content-based class is something I've sort of struggled with, but I had students as sort of a discussion activity create multiple choice questions, and then had the other students provide feedback on the other students' multiple choice questions. And then I take that set of questions that they generate and give them that as a pool of quiz questions that they can do multiple attempts on. And that worked out pretty well. There were some, gaps and some issues where sometimes there wasn't enough questions, but definitely like once they kind of bought in, it worked out pretty well. So
I've heard that being done by a number of people. There's, I think his Twitter address or his X address is that psych professor, who does something really similar where students create multiple choice questions, they give feedback on them, and then those are used in a very similar way. And the thought of them, it's a nice form of reflection because of thinking back about what's most important, what did they learn, how can we assess this, and the creation of questions are really useful. And Eric made a comment in chat that it's a single project or exam grade that's given often months later that may not be given by the professor who taught the class, which is actually how in PhD programs, again, as Robert had made, is often done. I know the people who were on the committees for my preliminary exams were not the people who generally taught the classes, so that you had to get it passed by a broader committee of people separate from the ones who actually had taught. So PhD programs change much more slowly than other types of instruction.
The career coach in me also loves these models where the students negotiate more and get more in the say, because I think that models the world of work and the labor market and how you really are negotiating your worth and marks and documentation the whole way through. So
And that's a nice way of including some career competencies in classes too, saying that this is something you're going to have to be doing when, you know, you're looking for a promotion or whatever. You have to be able to document a case for this based on what you've done and what you've learned and what you've achieved. So.
Yeah, I talk all the time with my husband who's in advertising, and he works for an advertising firm, and that's exactly how they, you know, do their annual reviews and, you know, things for promotion and raises and all of that. And so, you know, we talk often about how, you know, why aren't we encouraging our students to do this in the classroom, because we're not always socialized to kind of advocate for ourselves, and it's a, you know, really good way to also get them really aware of having concrete evidence to show that they are, you know, accomplishing these things, so that, you know, they're making a case based on a solid foundation. So anyway, I can go on.
Me too. I hear you.
Any other comments or thoughts, or any other experiments that you've done or considered doing? And we do have a session later today, actually. Is it coming up? It's this afternoon, I think, right?
Yep, this afternoon.
On ungrading.
2:00.
That Maggie will be doing.
Yeah.
So if you
And
want
I'll
to hear.
be, yeah, talking all about this. All about my experience with it and my hopes for doing it again this semester.
And I would encourage anyone who wants to join in on the reading group we have. It's been a lot of fun doing it, and Jessamine is just a wonderful colleague. And we've got a really good group of colleagues at SUNY Plattsburgh who've been participating in, I think, about 6 or 7 of these so far. We do them generally every spring and fall. And in the fall, we were doing 2 at a time, which was just insane. We were doing them in alternating weeks. This time, we're only doing the one, at least so far, we're only doing the one this spring on grading for growth.
And it's low stakes, you know, so, you know, I think everyone has something to contribute, even if you didn't get to all of the reading in any particular week. Just, you know, always feel free to join in and listen and share.
Is that something, you know, I'm part of SUNY, but not the Oswego Plattsburgh community.
You are welcome to join us.
In fact, we'll be using the same URL.
Yeah,
it's all set up so anyone can join in. So anytime you want to join in, we'll be posting a schedule of it. I was looking for the email so I could post the schedule last night. I couldn't find it. We do have a schedule set up. It's on our calendar, but we'll be sharing that. If you don't. It'll be on our website very short, probably within a week or so.
It's on Plattsburgh's website already, so
okay.
It is there. But email us, and we'll, you know, absolutely get you to the right page so you have it all.
It's going to be every other Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, beginning I think on February 5th or 6th. So it's that week, 5th, 6th, and 7th, or something like that, or 6th, 7th, and 8th.
Okay, I have one final grad class this spring, so I think I'm just thinking more like the future semesters when I'm like, I want to reconnect. How do I find those folks? I certainly will have your emails after this week. And it's been so nice again to participate.
We've been doing 2 to 3 reading groups a year, so and they've been all with Plattsburgh. So
very cool. I read a lot, but sometimes I do just wish I need somebody to talk this through with, or like, what do they mean by that? Am I totally interpreting this, you know, through my lens?
Well, that's looking for it.
Right. Yes. I love that you all do that. And my campus has some things. A lot of them though are just face to face. And now I'm on the satellite campus. So, and when I wasn't, a lot of times they conflicted with class. So it's a synchronous, your book structure.
Yeah. And we try to alternate the times, you know, throughout the week, so that if you do have class, you can join in on a different session, or if something comes up, you have an appointment in a session you typically go to, there's other sessions, you know, to be able to jump in. And
very nice.
Yeah.
So awesome. Well, I don't mean to circle back, but I couldn't really formulate my question. You were saying about what we've tried. And I don't even know if this is what method this would be under of the alternative gradings you just shared, but I really tried to I have an incoming student group as well. So they're transitioning to college, and I went to like an accumulation, I'll call it like accumulation. I pretty much was like, here's lots of habits that will help you succeed in college. So this was a class out of the Success Center. If you think, like I said, welcome to college, it has pretty open student learning objectives, which also can make it wild. So I really just went from like, here's what you don't know, you might not know you don't know with my freshmen, and really just trying to incentivize and give points to those habits. But when I presented this like accumulation model, they sort of seemed overwhelmed with like deciding which habits to try out and do. So I didn't know if you had any advice. I know we were always talking about keep it simple, and this isn't necessarily a grading pedagogy, but I don't know. I go
Actually,
back and forth with how much choice is good. Like, when do we cross the line into like too much choice, or how do I support them in focusing when I offer a more open?
encouraging students to do retrieval practice is probably one of the most important things. And that's one case where AI tools could be really useful. You know, if there's something that students aren't understanding, ask them to ask ChatGPT or one of the other tools to give them some questions on it, and to give them and to evaluate the work and give them feedback, or ask them to generate a summary of concepts they don't understand. And that can be really helpful. But in general, encourage students to use feedback is a really good strategy. I'm sorry, to do retrieval practice. Encouraging
And I
to
teach
space
that.
their-
A lot of them don't do it for
encouraging-
other classes. I don't know, because my class is not embedded. We did build some of that model, like, oh, this is a high DWF course, so we built in like an attached recitation that has some of these transition skills, and those seem easier because you know exactly what's going on in the graded, like, and my
Right.
class is graded A through F, and it has GPA, this transition course I'm talking about, but yeah, they just, I don't know, it almost seemed like when I had more choices and when I went to the accumulation model, they just kind of seemed overwhelmed and didn't then accumulate. And I just wondered if you had thoughts or.
Well, one thing, actually, we're working on an experiment that we're going to try in our large intro class, either this spring or in the fall. We're actually working on the IRB proposal, Theo. But in any case, working with Michelle Miller, who's the author of Binds Online, and also, what was her most recent book? I know it, but I can't think of it offhand. I didn't get much sleep last night. In any case, we've got 4 modules we're going to be using, where students do either watch a video, listen to a podcast, do a little bit of reading, and then they commit to trying some techniques in the classes. And then we're going to check at the end of the term to see, ask them whether they have done that. And we're going to try tracking their progress, so to see whether that made a difference. You know, the classes aren't large enough to really get a random control study, although it would be much nicer if we could do that. But the focus we're going to do, the main areas, one is space retrieval practice. We're combining into one module. We've got another module on procrastination, looking at the use of commitment devices and encouraging them to adopt some type of commitment device to do that, you know, either with their friends or colleagues, or some other form of commitment. We've got another module on dealing with distractions, on avoiding multitasking and so forth, with some apps we're encouraging them to try using on their phones to shut them down when they're studying or while they're in class, and so on. And I forgot what the 4th module is. But basically, we're trying a fairly simple commitment that we're going to be starting to implement. I'm hoping really soon. We've gotten a bit bogged down because, well, one of the people I'm working with was sick. Another person was, his father is not doing so well, and I've just been kind of buried in these 92 workshops and preparing for them. So, but we're hoping to do that, if not this spring, certainly in the fall, in our large classes, and we'll have something. We'll know more about that within a year.
Right. Well, I will watch for your name coupled with Michelle Miller, and in a couple of years.
Michelle is amazing, by the way.
Hmm?
Michelle is amazing. She was one of the editors of the West Virginia University press series on teaching and learning, and now she's an editor of the new series in, I think it's Oregon. I've got to check, but basically a new variant of the series has moved since the West Virginia University Press has effectively shut down their teaching and learning series. So,
if you don't mind sharing, like when you say a commitment device, because I sort of feel like I had that built into my class. I had it built in as an external motivator. So one of the major point accumulations in my course is the end of it. It's only 10 weeks so that they can use the last month to prep for finals, but we call it an integration presentation. So we're teaching more than 4 focused topics, but from there they're supposed, like, and this is from the beginning of the course, advertise, like this is a major way we wrap up things that we are talking about. You then present how you are integrating this into your life. And so they teach back the topics, but a lot of the examples of integration come from like high school, and these are first semester. So it's recent life, but it's not like you learned it with me and then tried it. So I like your concept of the commitment device. I feel like it leans on internalization, right? Like I know.
Yeah, a commitment device is actually something that came out of behavioral economics. So it's a mix of economics and psychology. And basically, the problem is we have our short-term incentives and our long-term objectives, and they don't always align very well. That, we know what we'd like to do in the long term, but it's always easier to postpone that until later because, the easiest time to start a new study strategy or to start writing a paper is tomorrow, and tomorrow never quite gets there. And basically what commitment devices do is they alter incentives by more closely aligning your short-term incentives with your long-term goals. And there's some really simple ones, which is perhaps forming a study group with friends and agreeing to meet at a specific time and focusing on specific classes on regular days, because then you've now made this commitment to your peers that you're going to do it. There's other places like stick.com, which is created by a friend of mine, Dean Carlin, who's an economist. He's actually now the director of USAID, the economics director for USAID, AID. And what you do there is you make a commitment and you actually give them your credit card number. And what happens, you find someone who will agree to be your partner on the commitment and will verify that you met your goals. And basically you give them the credit card number, but as long as you meet your goals, there's no cost. Nothing is used. But if you don't meet your goals, you have to make some payment and you specify the amount. But it could be to a charity, but what they actually recommend is you use an anti-charity. Specifically, for example, if you're a liberal, it might go to a Republican super PAC, or it might go to the NRA. If you're a conservative, it might go to the ACLU, or it might go to a Democrat super PAC. So that way it raises the cost of not meeting your commitment. And that's been found in a number of studies that have been published to be very effective in encouraging better alignment with between short-term incentives and long-term objectives. There's a number of others that we mentioned, but that's one of the most effective ones in practice. There was
That's really interesting. Driven by spite, I sort of feel like, right? Like I don't want my money to go to those people, so I'm gonna do it.
Exactly. Well, the way it started actually was Dean, when he was in grad school at the University of Chicago, made a bet with his friend. They both wanted to lose weight, but they were spending so much time sitting and in coffee shops and so forth, where they bet $1,000 basically each week if they agreed to give the other person $1,000 if they did not meet their weight target for the week. And they met their weight targets all the way through because neither wanted to pay the other $1,000. And they knew that because they were both economists, and they knew the cost was fairly large, and they wanted to be sure they met those objectives. But there's certainly simpler things like just making a commitment to your friends to study at certain times, and that could be pretty effective.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, we're going to stop this session and we're going to exit for a minute before we go into the next session on adding supportive structure to Brightspace, because we've got to get the last 2 videos rendered so we can get them posted. And all the videos are posted by the end of the day on the schedule. So thank you. It's good seeing everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll be right back.